So I can't think of a more fitting setting to give a warm NGLC welcome to CNN's Soledad O'Brien.
Good morning and welcome. When you come into the world with the name Maria de la Soledad Teresa Marchetti O'Brien, which can be a heavy burden in the North Shore of Long Island, where nobody speaks Spanish and nobody looks like I did, I sort of knew I'd be talking about diversity and who I was and where I fit in my whole entire life. I grew up in a part of town in Long Island where your biggest desire in 7th grade was to figure out how to wing your hair like Farrah Fawcett. My hair does not wing. Your biggest desire was, when you had a name like Soledad, to make it solely with a heart over the I, so that everybody felt like they got your name. I started working in television news in 1987, and one of my very first paying jobs, was to remove staples from a wall. Yes, that's a paying job. Doesn't pay well, but that was my job. And I would go around the entire building and take staples out of the wall, the bulletin boards. And my parents, who had spent roughly $100,000 on my education at Harvard, to say they were horrified does not even come close to how they felt about their daughter doing this. But I loved it, because I love being, even in my own little way, being part of a team that was responsible for putting something on the air, something that would say something in such an important medium. We'd be so busy during breaking news at this TV station in Boston that the women would literally take off their heels to be able to run down the hallways and pop the tape in to make air. And I've seen nodding of heads, you guys know this. And then you'd have to press play and wait 1, 2, 3 while it queued up. And you'd be like, the anchor would be stretching the lead, and finally it would work. I love being part of that kind of team. I had a boss who had a number of problems. He had a wife, a long list of problems, but I'll just tell you some of them. He had a wife and 4 kids and a lovely girlfriend, hence all of his problems. And I used to work the overnight shift with him, truly. And there would be just me and him in the office in the middle of the night, and he would come in as if it were perfectly normal and go sleep on his couch. And I'd say, "How are you?" And that was the kind of relationship we had. Since anybody who had ever worked as a production assistant, which was my job, wanted to move ahead as quickly as possible, one of the things you would do is run out and get sound, do these little snippets of interviews. And that meant you got to run out and grab a couple of quick sound bites from the mayor or from the police chief or whatever. Nothing too critical that you could screw it up, but just enough to get a little experience. And so it was a great gig, because our jobs paid so badly that one of the things I would do, you could get more money if you were somehow, they had to, by contract, the union contracts, if you were in the piece. So, for example, when you got to get sound with the mayor, you would ask such leading questions that they couldn't edit around your question, and you'd make $35 extra. Whenever you would do an interview, you'd put your fingers so close to the top of the mic that they couldn't cut your fingers out. And if your fingers were in the shot, they'd have to pay you $25 more, and you could actually make your rent that way. I worked as a PA and had done that many times, and I decided that I wanted to move ahead, and I went to see my boss, this boss who had many problems, and sat down with him, wrote up a list of all the interviews I had done, and I asked to meet with him, and I asked my boyfriend at the time, who's now my husband, if he would just run through a practice with me. Sat down, he'd ask me this question: why do you want to get promoted? What do you think you can do? What can you bring to this company? And I sat down with this boss of mine, and he said to me, "Who are you, and what do you do here?" And I realized that I hadn't prepared actually for that kind of question, and so I did not get the promotion that day. But eventually I did, and I became a writer and a writer trainee before that, an associate producer and then a producer. And in my very first job interview to try to become a reporter, I sat down with the news director in Springfield, Massachusetts. And he said to me, after what I thought was a really good interview, he said, to the point where they showed me all the gear in the ENG department, like a long interview. And he said to me, "Well, we're not going to hire you. We only have one job for a black person, and you don't read black enough to be black on TV." And I could remember thinking, I'm not sure if I should be more offended that there's only one job in a town that actually had a sizable minority population, or conversely, should I be more offended that I will not get said job because of this person's preconceived notions about what I should look like. Not long after, about 24 hours later, I had a job interview in Hartford, Connecticut. And same thing, great interview, got along with the guy, had a decent resume, and he said to me, now, Soledad, that's an interesting name. Interesting in the bad way, when someone says interesting, like, you know that's not gonna work here. And he said, would you think about changing your name? Because his audience wouldn't understand someone with the name Soledad. Even though I grew up in Long Island with, everyone around me could pronounce my name. And I remember thinking, my name is Maria de la Soledad Teresa Marquetti O'Brien, which loosely translated is the Virgin Mary, which meant I would not change my name because I didn't want to be struck dead by lightning on my way home. But I remember calling my mother, as I did after every failed interview, and I'd say, I don't know what to do. I don't fit in this box that everybody thinks they know. And she said, Lovey, because she calls me Lovey, Lovey, don't worry about that. Go work with someone who gets you. Go find another job. That's exactly what I did. And I think it was my parents' trek as foreigners to this country that made them in some ways so completely unsympathetic when I had a problem like that. My mom is Cuban and my dad is Australian. And they met in 1958 at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, because they both attended daily mass. And my mom would walk, and my dad would drive, because he had a car. Whenever I tell this story to college students, I have to remind them, cars back then had windows that wound down, because they have no idea. Cell phones used to be this big. My dad used to wind down the window of his car and say to my mom, would you like a ride? My mother, who was going to daily mass, said, no, thank you. You don't take a ride from a man you don't know. Every day. I was like, Mommy, you don't even to daily mass? I mean, really, if there's a guy who should be a safe guy, it would be the guy sitting next to a daily mass. Every day, no. And she'd walk, and he'd drive, and he'd wind down the window, and no. And then one day she said, yes, I'll take a ride. And they went to daily mass together, and they came back, and they made a date to have a date that evening. And that day, they went to restaurant after restaurant, but no one would serve them, because my mom is black and Cuban, and my dad is white and Australian. And everywhere they went, they turned them away. He can come in, but she cannot come in. Everywhere. 1958 in Baltimore, Maryland. And so my mother took my father back to her apartment, and she's an amazing cook of fabulous Cuban food, and she made him dinner. And the entire point of her story was always, see, Lovey, if you can cook, you can get a man, truly. I like to say, I can't make it, but I can make it happen. For us, of course, we took a bigger lesson from that about navigating obstacles and plowing forward, frankly, even if people don't quite get where you're coming from. My parents decided to get married at the end of 1958 when interracial marriage was illegal. And so they got in their car and they drove to Washington, D.C., where they could legally get married. And then they drove back to Baltimore, Maryland, and lived illegally as a couple. And in fact, their friends would tell them, whatever you do, don't have biracial children. No one will understand where they're coming from. I'm number 5 of 6. My parents were terrible listeners every step of the way.